Mark sat at the kitchen table, staring at his cup of coffee. The morning sun filtered through the window, casting long golden streaks across the counter. He heard Linda moving around upstairs, the faint sound of drawers opening and closing. Another day had begun, another day of routine, another day of silence. They had been married for 30 years, 3 decades of shared memories, of raising their 2 children, of building a home together. And yet, Mark couldn't remember the last time they had a real conversation, one that wasn't about bills, their son's upcoming wedding, or the broken faucet in the bathroom. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when he and Linda would talk for hours, when she would laugh at his jokes, when she would lean her head on his shoulder while they watched TV. But now, the space between them felt vast, filled with unspoken words and quiet disappointments. Linda walked into the kitchen, dressed in her usual beige sweater and dark jeans. She poured herself a cup of coffee, not even glancing in his direction. "Morning," Mark said, trying to sound casual. "Morning," Linda replied, her voice neutral. She took a sip of coffee and turned toward the window. Mark hesitated. He wanted to say something, anything to break the distance between them. "Did you sleep well?" he finally asked. Linda shrugged. "Fine, I guess." Silence again. It stretched between them like an invisible wall. Mark sighed and picked up his phone, scrolling through the news, pretending he wasn't bothered. But he was. He missed her. He missed them. That evening, they went to their usual Friday night dinner at a small Italian restaurant they had been visiting for years. It had been their tradition since the kids moved out, a way to keep their connection alive. But lately, even these dinners felt like a formality rather than something they enjoyed. They sat across from each other, looking at the menu even though they both knew what they would order. "How was your day?" Linda asked, barely looking up. "Same as always," Mark replied. "Work, meetings, and a lot of emails. You?" Linda sighed. "I went to see Mom today. She's getting worse. I don't know how much longer she can stay in the house alone." Mark nodded. He knew Linda had been struggling with her mother's declining health, but she rarely talked about it in depth. "We could look into an assisted living place," he suggested. Linda frowned. "She doesn't want that. She says she's fine." "But she's not, is she?" Linda pressed her lips together, then looked down at her plate. "No, she's not." Mark reached across the table, resting his hand on hers. She flinched slightly, as if surprised, but didn't pull away. "You don't have to do this alone, Linda," he said softly. For the first time in months, she met his eyes, and for a moment there was something familiar there, something vulnerable, something real. A week later, after another silent dinner, Linda finally spoke up. "Mark, are we okay?" He looked at her, startled. "What do you mean?" She sighed, rubbing her temples. "I mean, us. Our marriage. We barely talk anymore. We don't laugh. We don't feel like a couple." Mark felt a pang in his chest. He had been thinking the same thing, but hearing her say it out loud made it feel even heavier. "I don't know," he admitted. "I feel like we're just existing." Linda nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I miss you." Mark swallowed hard. "I miss you too." They sat in silence, but this time it wasn't the same empty silence that had filled their home for months. It was different, full of questions, of hope, of the possibility that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. "Do you think we can fix this?" Linda asked. Mark reached for her hand again, this time holding it firmly. "I think we have to try." And for the first time in a long time, they both felt like they were finally being heard. This story captures the emotional distance that can grow in a long marriage, especially during midlife, when priorities shift, children leave home, and personal struggles take over. But it also shows that connection can be rebuilt if both partners are willing to try. Mark sat on the porch, staring at the fading sunset. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, a sight that once made him feel peaceful. But tonight, it only reminded him of how much had changed between him and Linda. She was inside, cleaning up after dinner, moving around the house with the same routine she had followed for years. They had been together for 3 decades, but lately, it felt like they were just two people sharing in a house rather than a life. It wasn't an argument that had created this distance. No dramatic betrayal, no single moment that broke them. It was something quieter, years of small disappointments, unspoken words, and a slow fading of intimacy. Mark sighed. He wondered if Linda noticed it too, or if she had simply accepted that this was what marriage became after so many years. One evening, Mark came home from work later than usual. Linda was sitting at the dining table, a half-empty glass of wine in front of her. "Long day?" she asked, her voice neutral. Mark loosened his tie and sat across from her. "Yeah, meetings, emails, the usual." She nodded but didn't say anything else. For years they had talked about everything. Work, their dreams, their worries. Now their conversations had been reduced to polite exchanges, nothing more. And suddenly Mark couldn't take it anymore. "Linda, are you happy?" he blurted out. She looked up, startled. "What?" He swallowed hard. "With me. With us. Are you happy?" Linda was quiet for a long moment. Then, with a sad smile, she said, "I don't know." The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. That night, Mark lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He knew that admitting the problem was only the first step. But what came next? Divorce, a forced attempt at rekindling something that might already be gone. He thought about their son's wedding in a few months, about the life they had built. Was it worth throwing away? Or worse, was it worth holding on to, even if it no longer brought them joy? Linda turned beside him, her breathing steady. He wanted to reach for her, to bridge the gap between them, but fear held him back. The next morning, Mark made a decision. Instead of scrolling through his phone over breakfast, he looked at Linda. Really looked at her. "You used to love walking by the lake in the mornings," he said. Linda raised an eyebrow. "That was years ago." "I know," Mark admitted, "but would you like to go with me today?" She hesitated. Then, to his surprise, she nodded. As they walked side by side, the air crisp around them, Mark felt something stir inside him, a memory of who they used to be, a small but powerful reminder that love doesn't just disappear. It fades. It weakens. But it can be revived, if both people are willing to try. Linda slipped her hand into his. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Maybe they weren't lost after all. Maybe they just needed to find their way back.